In this video, we'll take a look at 5 popular franchises that you may not have known were available on the NES. Growing up, I was a huge fan of the NES and spent countless hours playing my favorite games. As time went on, the games evolved and moved on to the 16-bit era and beyond. But I never forgot my roots. Imagine my surprise when I recently discovered that many of these beloved franchises had been adapted to the NES. However, the question remains, will these NES versions live up to the ones we already know and love? Join me as we discover hidden gems and uncover the nostalgia of these classic franchises on Nintendo Entertainment System. And stick around to the end for a special bonus, a game you won't believe exists on the NES. So, you ready to be surprised? Time to tune in and find out. Survive the horror on NES with Resident Evil. Well, okay, Biohazard. See, Resident Evil, originally on the PlayStation 1, has been surprisingly adapted for the NES under the title Biohazard. This is the original title for the series, and it's interesting to see how it holds up to the original game. I remember the first time I played Resident Evil, I was blown away by the voice acting, cheesy as it was, and the story. Up until then, I had never had a video game scare me. That, coupled with the idea of solving puzzles, fighting zombies in a cinematic way, really left an impression on me. But how will this fare on the NES? The gameplay here has been simplified, but surprisingly everything is still there. The dialogue from the story is still intact, and the mansion layout is exactly how you would expect it to be on the NES. The menus and save system are all here. The only real difference that comes into play is with the combat. When you come face to face with an enemy, you'll enter a first-person mode where a cursor will move back and forth across the screen while you time your button press just right to hit the red marker. Do this enough times, and your enemy will be destroyed. The graphics here are serviceable. You can tell what everything is supposed to be. For example, they use that sparkle effect to tell you where the items are hidden in the rooms. The sound here, however, is where the game is lacking, as there's only one main song that loops and plays throughout the entire mansion. It gets old fast. The difficulty level sort of depends on if you're familiar with the original Resident Evil game. You'll have a lot easier time knowing where everything is and how to solve the puzzles if you know that game. Overall, the game doesn't seem too difficult, especially for NES standards. In comparison to the original Resident Evil, the NES version captures the essence of the game, though it's a bit less scary than the original. So even if it's slightly jank, it still works. In my opinion, if you're a fan of Resident Evil and you're a fan of the NES, this is definitely worth checking out. Get ready for laughs and love with Larry and the Long Look for a Luscious Lover. Wow, that's a mouthful. Anyway, here we have a remake of the classic PC game Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards, which is now titled Larry and the Long Look for a Luscious Lover, made by Kevin Hanley of Kahan Games. This NES version stays true to the original game's story and mechanics, but with some necessary changes and updates. I remember having loads of fun with the Leisure Suit Larry series on my dad's 386 computer when I was probably way too young to be playing it. But the humor stayed with me for years, and now the nostalgia is strong. Let's see how the NES version stacks up. The gameplay here is standard for a point-and-click adventure game, though you're not really pointing and clicking. Here you control Larry as he walks around and interacts with various people and objects in a funny way, which moves the adventure forward. Personally, I think these graphics look exactly how you'd think they would look if a port had been made to the NES back in the day. The sound is also pretty great, and while I don't exactly remember the music of the original game, I'm fairly certain that some of the music on here is new and original to this game. The difficulty, in my opinion, is easier than the original, but that's mostly due to the changes they made, as you're not trying to guess the words to type in. Instead, you get straight to the gameplay by walking where you need to go, searching for things, finding objects, and interacting. The game's humor is definitely one of its strongest points, and it translates well to the NES platform. Fans of raunchy humor will appreciate this one. I recommend this game for anyone who loves the original Leisure Suit Larry, and for those who want a good laugh. Alright, let's get ready to launch into Angry Birds on the NES. So Angry Birds is a classic mobile game that has been adapted for the NES. The concept here is to launch birds at pigs in order to protect your eggs. My experience with Angry Birds is that it was one of the earliest mobile games I can remember playing and enjoying. This was back in college, often during my downtime or maybe during a boring lecture. I would pull the phone out and have a game of Angry Birds. It was a great way to pass the time. So let's see how this NES version compares to the original. The gameplay here is simple but challenging. You use a slingshot to launch birds at pigs and must strategize on the trajectory and power of the shot to take out all of the pigs and protect your eggs. The controls here are easy to learn, but require practice to master. But we'll get to some more about the controls in a minute. The graphics here are basic, but still captures the essence of the original game. The 8-bit art style is reminiscent of classic NES games, but the graphics are not quite as polished as the original mobile game. The sound here kind of flat out sucks. The chiptune that plays in an endless loop throughout the game can get repetitive really quickly. The difficulty level is different from the original game, as this version does not have the strategy of picking different birds for the job, nor does it use the tension that you use to pull back the slingshot. Nope, with this game you only have 5 positions you can pull your slingshot into, and no tension or alternate birds to pick from. So yeah, the controls are weird. Overall, while this version of Angry Birds captures the spirit and nostalgia of the original game, it doesn't quite live up to the gameplay and experience of the mobile version. The gameplay here is simple and fun, but the lack of strategy make it much less engaging than the original. It's worth a try for a quick nostalgia trip or just to see what it's like on the NES, but it's definitely not as satisfying as the mobile version. Let's spin dash into a classic with Sonic the Hedgehog on NES. Sonic the Hedgehog, the iconic blue blur that broke barriers and made Sega a household name, has finally made its way to the Nintendo Entertainment System. The two companies have been longtime rivals in the console wars, so it's fun to see Sonic, the symbol of Sega, on a Nintendo console. It's kind of like seeing your ex at a party. It's weird, but at the same time, it's still that same fun-loving Hedgehog you remember. So I remember eagerly awaiting the release of the original Sonic the Hedgehog game. As a kid who grew up with the Genesis console, I was excited to finally have a rival to Mario games. I got my hands on it day one, and it exceeded all my expectations. Great graphics, colors, fun, and challenging gameplay. Now as an adult, I'm excited to see if this NES port can live up to the nostalgia and hype of the original. In Sonic the Hedgehog, you play as a speedy hedgehog, platforming your way through various levels. Each contains 3 stages, and on the 3rd stage, you'll have a boss battle against Dr. Robotnik, aka the Eggman. He's captured Sonic's animal friends and imprisoned them inside of robots throughout the levels. Your job is to free all of these animals and defeat Dr. Robotnik. The graphics and music are fantastic here. They're pretty much exactly, if not better, than you can expect for the limitations of the NES. The only caveat I have in this department is that the hitbox isn't that great, and the controls are a little bit weird. They aren't bad per se, but they feel almost too tight at times and a little too loose at others, making for an odd combination. However, that's a small nitpick, especially once you get used to it. The difficulty level of this NES version is a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, the levels themselves aren't overly difficult to get through. There are an abundance of rings to keep you alive, which is a nice safety net. However, the levels are filled with enemies and projectiles, making it a challenge to make it to the end with your 50 rings. So while it's not impossible to beat the game, it does require some skill and practice to master the gameplay. Overall, if you've been looking for Sonic the Hedgehog on your Nintendo Entertainment System, this is a good one to get. The graphics and music are great, and the gameplay is still fun. Despite the small issues, it's a great nostalgic trip for fans of the original game. Going bananas for Donkey Kong Country on the NES. Donkey Kong Country, the game that made pre-rendered graphics a thing and gave us a gorilla with a tie and his sidekick with a passion for bananas, has made its way to the NES in a wild port, but can it hold a candle to the original version? What I remember most about the original Donkey Kong Country when it came out was competing with my stepfather to see who could beat the game first. We were like 2 gorillas trying to climb the same banana tree, just trying to see who can get through the game first. And while I liked the game, he eventually went on to the Nut House, and now his favorite game is who knows what. But that's a whole different story. So, how does this NES version stack up compared to the original? Well, surprisingly good. Pretty much everything that made the original what it is here. The graphics are not pre-rendered, but they totally work in the style of NES. The music is spot-on versions of the Super Nintendo game, only demade to 8-bit tones. Play control here feels great, and while it's a little different than its SNES counterpart, it really holds up. The difficulty, I would say, is on par with what you would expect, although due to the limitations of the NES, they had to cut some content. So, all in all, this may be one of the best ports on this list. It's a great way to relive the classic Donkey Kong Country experience with that touch of nostalgia, and while I can't guarantee it'll bring back memories of competing with your own family or friends, it might make you want to tie a tie on a gorilla. Alright, and here's the bonus game we promised. Rainbow Bright, a colorful adventure on the NES. Rainbow Bright, the beloved cartoon character and icon of colorful creativity, has made her way to the NES in an officially Hallmark licensed game. Personally, my sister was a big fan of Rainbow Bright growing up, and I found the show to be tolerable. Heck, we even saw the movie together in the theater, so I was kind of excited to see the game adaptation on NES. As an overhead adventure similar to The Legend of Zelda, players must navigate through various levels, collecting stars, and rescuing one of Rainbow Bright's friends in order to unlock the boss of each level. The gameplay here is alright, as mainly you're navigating through levels and mostly avoiding enemies. The controls are responsive and easy to pick up, making for a smooth gameplay experience. The graphics are colorful and fitting for the Rainbow Bright universe. It's like playing Legend of Zelda with a rainbow filter on. The music here is decent, but I don't know if it's inspired by the show or not, so maybe you can tell me in the comments. You know, for a Rainbow Bright game, the level music is kind of dark sounding, but I digress. The difficulty level here is on par with what you would expect for a kid's game, so the game is fairly easy, with the exceptions of the boss encounters. You could say it's like a rainbow walk in the park, except the park is full of creatures who want to see you destroyed. Overall, Rainbow Bright on the NES is a fun and colorful adventure that fans of the show and adventure games alike should enjoy. It's a perfect way to relive the nostalgia of Rainbow Bright and have a fun adventure at the same time. Just don't expect to be challenged too much, unless you're playing against your sister in a race to collect all the stars. In conclusion, these NES adaptations of popular franchises may not be the exact same as the games we know and love, but they still offer a fun and nostalgic trip down memory lane. From Resident Evil's simplified but spooky gameplay to Leisure Suit Larry's hilarious and raunchy adventure, these games offer a unique and enjoyable experience. Whether you're a die-hard fan of these franchises or just looking for some retro gaming fun, these NES versions are mostly worth checking out. That's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and discovered some new games to check out on your NES. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more Hidden Gem videos. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.